Welcome back on Punchline. Now, before the break, we gave you a presentation on the ghost of numbers, of course, just pertaining to this BBI conversation, even as we head into a possible referendum come the year 2021. And joining me live in studio right now is lawyer Kakai Kissinger, who's a constitutional lawyer, a human rights activist, and also serves in the BBI National Secretariat. Good evening, Kakai.
Good evening, and thank you for the invite.
Thank you very much for making time for us. So let's just get straight into it. So I want to begin with something that's close to your heart because you're a constitutional lawyer yourself, and this is one of the proposals that's in the BBI, and it's that of the appointment of the judicial ombudsman by the president. Now, when you look at this from a constitutional perspective, he doesn't necessarily appoint the judicial ombudsman, but rather nominates one who's then subjected to the National Assembly for approval. But then again, how do you communicate to these people that are coming from the school of thought that just as much as the president might be nominating this candidate for approval to the National Assembly, he or she still controls the bigger majority of the numbers in the National Assembly, which therefore means it's some sort of indirect appointment?
Thank you. That issue of the judiciary ombudsman, I think, has brought in some concerns. People are complaining because people didn't understand how this process is being done. But we've tried through the Secretariat to train people, to sensitize politicians, to sensitize governors, senators, and all that are concerned of the importance of that office. First and foremost, the judiciary ombudsman is being nominated by the president. Once nominated by the president, he is being taken to the Senate, actually not the National Assembly, to the Senate for approval. So the Senate is taking the role of actually vetting the judiciary ombudsman. And the reason why the Senate is taking that decision is, in my view, if you ask me, judicial functions are devolved functions, because if you go to every county, you will at least find a high court, and in every county, you will find enough magistrates' courts. So the purpose of the judicial ombudsman is to be vetted by the Senate and then, of course, appointed by the president. Now, there is nothing wrong with that procedure or that kind of a process. The reason being, the judiciary ombudsman exists at the moment, but it exists in the sense that at the moment the current structure is that the judicial ombudsman is appointed by the Chief Justice. Now, what was the logic and the reasoning behind the introduction of this office in the judiciary is that you need to ask yourself that you have three arms of government: the judiciary, the executive, and of course the National Assembly or Parliament, for that matter, the legislature. Now, all these arms of government have mechanisms of checks and balances. Yes. And the question that was missing is where are the checks and balances within the judiciary itself? If you listen to the Chief Justice, who has actually since retired or is on terminal leave, he accepts that there's need for the judiciary to be checked and to be given enough checks and balances. But that was completely missing within that institution. So this office, therefore, is established to actually provide more checks and balances within the institution of the judiciary. It's a plus to actually have this office. And there's no conflict at all. And remember that there's going to be a process where a proper legal framework or a law will be established to ensure that the conflict or the fear that might exist between that office is removed. Because if the fear is that the judicial ombudsman will have conflict with the Judicial Service Commission, or if the judicial ombudsman will have conflict with the executive or the legislature, then that will be removed, because there's a law which is going to come in place giving proper legal framework for the judicial ombudsman. So this is a good thing for the institution. And if you listen to the outgoing Chief Justice, they have no problem with this office. I think the problem they had with this office, they didn't understand that there will be another legal framework that will come in place to sensitize and completely to concretize this office in terms of how it operates. Every arm of government must have checks and balances, and that office is going to provide proper checks and balances within the judiciary.
Okay, just allow me to jump in there. You've talked about the CJ, the outgoing CJ. They didn't necessarily have an issue with this particular proposal because they didn't understand it. Because when he weighed in, he said that this is a direct conflict and duplication of roles between the Ombudsman and the Judicial Service Commission. So you're saying this was before they understood it and now they get it?
No, I don't think he got it.
Yes.
Because there's what the Constitution is doing. No, constitutional making provides a policy. It's at policy level. What the Constitution is saying, let there be an office of the Ombudsman.
Yes.
The mechanisms of how that office will work will be anchored in legislation. So there will be a legal framework, comprehensive legal framework of how that office will be anchored. It's at that point, if there's any conflict within the JSC and the Ombudsman, that should be raised. But as of now, there are no conflict. What the Constitution is saying, we must provide for checks and balances within the judiciary itself. It's healthy. Executive is checked because we have independent institutions in the Constitution that checks the executive. Parliament is checked. We have independent institution that checks Parliament. Judiciary actually checks Parliament. Judiciary checks the executive. Who checks the judiciary? Nobody checks the judiciary. So what this office is coming in is to provide checks and balances. Remember, Parliament gets its money from Exchequer, Judiciary gets money from Exchequer, National Assembly gets its money from Exchequer, and they are all admitting and have accepted to be checked. Right. So there's no conflict in checking the judiciary. Actually, the judiciary should be so happy to have this office in place and ensure that there's a proper mechanism that will enhance transparency and checking that institution.
All right, very well put. So let's just progress with this discussion. Yesterday, the president had his speech on the Jamhuri Day celebrations, and as opposed to the previous speeches where it's usually pegged on the current government's scorecard, a big part of this speech was on the BBI and the president emphasizing on the importance of this document moving forward because it was going to solve some of the issues that we have been grappling with as a nation. And one of these issues is the decentralization of the executive and breaking it down so that you can accommodate more people at the apex. But you have those who are not for the document from Deputy President's side. They're saying this is not going to solve the issue of inclusivity. You are in the BBI National Secretariat. How does decentralizing the government and having a few people at the top solving the issue of inclusivity?
One of the greatest moments in the president's speech, if you listened to him either on radio, you listened to him on national television, or you followed him on social media, and so forth and so on. One of the most important aspects of that speech came in page 14 to page 18 of his speech. And in between those pages, he actually went back to 1963. And he was reminding Kenyans that our constitution is a living document. Living document means, therefore, that at any given time, if Kenyans feel they want to change that constitution, can change it because it's a constitution that must serve Kenyans. And he took us through the importance of doing that. Now, remember, in 2010, when we were coming up with the current constitution that we are now attempting to change, most Kenyans who went through that process said that that constitution in 2010 was 80% good but 20% wrong. Now, the president was recalling and saying, even though we have a constitutional making process and people are afraid of going through constitutional making process, we must actually come out of our fear and ask ourselves, what is it that we are actually doing? Now, let me ask you a question. In 2010, when we came up with that constitution never imagined what we are now talking about in terms of the BBI. So the 20% that Kenyans were complaining that is not good in 2010 is what BBI is actually trying to do in terms of solving that challenge. Are we seeing, for example, that in the current BBI process, we have those 9 clusters that we've been talking about? Issues of divisive election, issues of inclusivity, issues of security concerns, issues of devolution. All those 9 issues that we've been talking about are some of the things that, in my view, were missing in the 2010 Constitution. For example, the 2010 Constitution never dealt with issues of checks and balances within the judiciary. The BBI process right now is saying there has to be checks and balances within that institution called the judiciary, which is a good thing for the country. The 2010 Constitution never dealt with divisive elections. We've had quite a number of elections. Look at the last election that we had, divided this country completely. This kind of BBI right now is saying, to solve that problem, you must now have a framework, a proper framework in the Constitution and in legislation whereby elections is no longer a concern for Kenyans. Kenyans should never go to a poll afraid of going to elect their leaders or come out of that election with the problems that follow after the election. So that's a position whereby those who now lose in the election are being included in government. The issue of inclusivity was not addressed in the 2010 Constitution. The issue of inclusivity is being addressed now. If you lost the election, for example, you got the second highest presidential vote and you lost presidency, you are going to be included in the government. Those 5 positions in the executive, the prime minister, the official position, the president, the deputy president, those two deputy premiers, they are all purposes of inclusivity. The 2010 Constitution has none of that. So this BBI, as the president was talking about, and I want to remind Kenyans, please read his speech from page 14 to page 18. Completely captures the classical aspects of BBI. Yes. Why this document is so critical for Kenyans that when it is actually goes through, we will never, ever, as a country, find ourselves where we were in the past after elections.
All right. Okay, fair enough. Let me now just cut this conversation short for a while, and we need to take a break. But when I get after this break, we'll be discussing more on matters BBI and why it is important for us to read this document, internalize it, so that we can actually see the benefits that comes with it. Do stay with us. I'll be back in a short while.